Hi guys, my name's Tom. Welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for all of the feedback from the last video, which was the plein air out here in Pembrokeshire. Everyone seemed to really love it. Loads more of that to come. This is going to be quite a simple video. We're just going to look at one example of using pretty much just a single wash in a watercolour. This can be a really fun way to work, very fresh, very immediate, trying not to layer up too much. It's also an opportunity to have fun, play around with the pigment and see what we can create. I hope you enjoy this one. Let's have a look. Right guys, so the idea here is apart from a few little bits here and there, little finishing touches, the majority of this painting is going to be done just using a single wash. And so I kick off with ultramarine blue, laying in the shadow tone of the hat. And then I'm variating the wash by dropping in a similar consistency and tone of other colours. And then we just let the medium, the watercolour, just do its thing. I realised my tone here was a little bit too light. And because I want to try and get it all in the first wash, while it's still damp, I can actually come back in with a slightly stronger, creamier pigment and just sort of drop it in there. Watercolour's a lot more forgiving often than we think it is, and this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit more in this video and a lot more in some future videos. But while the wash is still damp from the hat, I bring in a slightly darker colour for the shadow of the face, just letting all of the colour run together so we get this lovely kind of flowing wash. Lots of soft edges, so working wet into wet like this or damp into damp is great for shadows because we want slightly softer, fuzzier, less defined edges in the shadows. And I just keep moving the paint around, moving the wash along. Working on a tilt allows us to kind of work and use gravity in our favour. Really useful technique for this sort of approach is also softening edges. So with the wash of the shadow on the face and getting a very hard edge between the light and the shadow, which is kind of what we want, but I just go in with a damp brush and hit the edge, which gives it a slightly softer feeling in places. So we want that balance of very soft edges in the shadows and lost edges, hard and soft edges between light and shadow. Then another key element of this is whilst this first wash is still wet, I continue to work into it with increasingly darker, therefore creamier, thicker paint. So it's still a first wash, lay down the lighter shadow tone, and as it's drying, but it's still got a dampness to it, I come in with thicker pigment, and that allows us to build depth of tone and contrast into the shadows, but still in a very kind of wet into wet, damp into damp, soft way. So we continue with the soft edges. Particularly in this subject, you'll find that there's natural stopping points. So we can still paint all the areas as one wash, getting them to flow together. It doesn't matter that the hat becomes the face, etc. But you will find there's natural stopping points. So the shadow of the hat merging into the shadow of the face. And what I tend to do is blur my eyes and look for areas of similar or identical tone. And we know that we can paint those as one and then kind of stop and deal with the other areas separately. And this allows us to work in smaller areas, but working wet into wet for longer. Now, I'd be the first to admit that the face at the moment looks very strange. I have made the shadow colour as it is in the reference photo, but it looks a bit odd at the moment. I'm continuing to build in those shadow shapes, and notice I'm painting shapes, not objects. I'm painting the shapes, not his features. Painting eyes, noses, mouths feels quite hard and scary. But if I just look at the simple shape, in this case just the simple shadow shape, I start with the gentlest shadow first and then introduce the darker tones. It makes tackling anything much, much easier. Now finally, again, still using a single wash, I come in with a much lighter tone. So we're now painting the light family, and it's a nice soft kind of warm orangey colour. I lay it in and then I start to soften edges with a slightly damp, clean brush, and we get this interesting kind of painterly realism happening. And the realism is born out of the correct tones. So tonal values are going to give you light, shape, form, depth, and also realism. We can make them very, very simple, i.e. just light family, shadow family, but it's those tonal values that work together to give the illusion of our subject. Now just a nice simple big wash for the body, and I kind of want the contrast of a slightly more realistic and refined face. I'm going to contrast that with a much more kind of abstract and free-flowing body and arm area. Get that nice play of the two. So now, while this first wash is still got a dampness to it, I come in with a thicker, creamier pigment of the same colour, which is going to give us a darker tone. And by the combination of the thickness of the paint in my brush and the level of wetness on the page, we get certain levels of softness and wet into wet. However, I decide that this is all getting a little bit too neat and a little bit too kind of literal. So what you'll see me do in a minute is actually just take a whole load of clean water and throw it into this wash. Now this is something I wanted to talk about, because this is where watercolour, as long as watercolour is wet and there's still wetness on the page, watercolour is a lot more forgiving than we initially think. We might think like, oh, I've laid all of that in, that's it, there's not a lot I can do. In some cases, if it had dried more, yes, that would be correct. But here, I have loads of fun with the pigment. I chuck loads of water into it. I then throw more dark pigment in. And then I chuck more water into it. I'm pulling pigment out with a clean brush. I'm moving the pigment around. Yes, you need a sensitivity to the medium, and you need to understand that you can't work it too hard. But at the same time, as long as watercolour is still very wet, there's lots of water on the page, it's a lot more of a forgiving and freeing medium than we might think. It's a little trickier than the other mediums because it's harder to make changes once it's dried, but when it's wet, if it's still wet, it's fine. If it's dried, it's dyed, but if it's wet, it's alive. And if it's alive, you can play with it and do things and move things around, have fun with it. So now I'm starting to try and get a bit more expressive with the body area. I'm taking clean or nearly clean paint and water and purposely hitting the edges of the wash of the body, letting the colours kind of bleed out. And then whilst this has still got a little bit of dampness on the page, I come back in with this creamier, darker pigment, and I start placing that in places. So I'm not sharpening up every single edge. I'm not defining every single edge. I want the free-flowing kind of abstract feel of the initial underlying wash to very much dominate, but then a few little hits and brush strokes of dark over the top, whilst it's still damp, so the edges of those marks soften, is going to be a really beautiful contrast of different things going on. And with something like this, less is definitely more. So I've got a feeling that I want to go in and do more to it, but I really kind of hold off and stop myself from fiddling too much. I let that dry off completely. And then we take the exact same approach of this single shadow wash into the hand. Now you could paint the light tones first and then glaze the shadows on top. That's another perfectly acceptable way to do it. But in this case, like I said, I'm not too rigidly, but I'm trying to take the approach of kind of glazing a shadow tone first, the lighter shadow tone. As that lighter shadow tone dries, drop in a darker tone, leaving the whites of the page for the light family, and then I can come back in and just glaze the kind of, with a single simple fresh wash, I can just glaze the light colour on top. I can soften edges if I need to using that damp brush again. Exactly the same approach into the trumpet. Simple single wash, lay down the slightly lighter tone first, leaving plenty of whites of the page, come in with a clean damp brush to soften edges, a balance of small refined shapes versus big darker shapes. Once I'm happy that I've got the kind of the accurate yet simple shape of the trumpet, then I can choose to use the brush to kind of break out and create some more dynamic and exciting brush strokes. It's this combination all the time of refinement and control versus abstract and letting loose. Where can you let loose and be a bit more free? This is a great area for it in the background. Still being conscious that I want that background to maybe trap a little bit of light on the top of the trumpet, and I don't want to go into the face too much, but really I can kind of do whatever I like here. And having a good play, and also quite a light colour. So worst case scenario, something happens that I don't like, and I can either wash it out or I can let it dry and go dark over the top. So again, lots of water and keeping it light to start with gives us freedom in watercolour, particularly when we're working in a single wash like this. And then as that first wash begins to dry, I start to drop into it, while it's still wet, this creamier, darker paint. So you'll notice there's like a rhythm and a process here. Generally start lighter, wet into wet, large shapes, As it dries, we get progressively darker, progressively more refined and defined, and progressively smaller shapes. And it's this kind of process within the painting as a whole, but we can also break the subject up and take that process into individual areas. And this is how you can tackle what appears to be quite a complex subject using a series of just nice, simple, fresh, single washes, slowly dropping darks in as we go. Then what you'll see is that I don't really go over and add any second washes in many areas. I decide to deepen the tone of the hand there, so that's kind of a second wash or a glaze over the top just to deepen the shadow and strengthen the colour a little bit more. His neckerchief, I'm now coming in with a second wash, which is basically just the red colour in shadow. The reason I do this is because I wanted a nice strong boundary between light and shadow, and I could have done it by glazing the bright red on later, but I did it the way that I usually do things. And now I'm doing what I would call the finishing touches. That's a little secondary glaze of shadow just on his shoulder there, ties in nicely with the shadow that's been cast over his face. And these little finishing touches are predominantly very, very creamy darks or a completely dry brush. So I'm going to use a dry brush in a sec to kind of flick on little finishing details, little touches, the kind of stitching on his jacket there, which really brings it to life. So we get that contrast of sharp, textured, broken, dry brush marks over the lovely free-flowing washes. So all the time we've got that contrast, light and shadow, soft and hard, strong colour versus more muted colour, small shapes versus large shapes, refined areas versus more abstract areas. All of these little contrasts are going on all the time, even within this kind of single wash watercolour. And there we have him. So one of the benefits I think of working like this is you do get a kind of a freshness to the paint that once you start getting into 2 layers, it can still be there, but you have to be more conscious of what you're doing with those layers and what colours you're using. This is just a nice, simple approach to painting watercolour, and it also allows us to follow this process in a very simple way. If it's light, we either leave it as white of the page and glaze over it later, or glaze over it first. We're really dealing here with just painting the shadows, and we just ask ourselves initially, what tone is it? And we paint the kind of the lighter tone, and then as it begins to dry, we slowly drop in the darker tones so that we get this lovely kind of wet into wet softness. The level of softness we get depends on how wet the page is and what sort of consistency of paint we've got in the brush. And like I said, aside from that, it's an opportunity to play around with lots of free-flowing washes, and then just these little kind of flicks of detail over the top, or these little bits of dry brush, or these little dark accents that just sharpen up certain areas and kind of make it pop. And hopefully you can see how some areas are a bit more refined and realistic, and other areas have been left a little bit more abstract and free-flowing, and it's those combination of the two that really work. And what you'll realize is that having more refined areas or more realistic areas kind of gives you a bit more confidence to leave other areas more abstract and where we've just kind of let the paint do its thing, like his arm, like the bottom right hand corner, for example. Right guys, that was it. A nice simple video this time, quite a nice simple concept. I just wanted to share it with you. That particular painting was a demonstration from the recent masterclass course that I ran. I do have loads of Zoom demonstrations coming up, loads more information about an upcoming masterclass series which is releasing very soon, and the very new online watercolour school which hopefully will be released in early September. So we're literally days away from that. Until next time guys, happy living, happy painting, and I'll see you soon.